Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. We're back with another installment of 20th Century Boys, and I'm happy to report things are finally picking up in the third act. I have criticized the third act for being very slow to start, for having a lot of exposition that I think could have been delivered faster and in more interesting ways. But, but, at this point, we have all of our players set up and all of the world building necessary to get us over the last time jump in place. And when we last left, we had the revelation that whoever is playing the role of friend in the FDP headquarters is not the person who was the friend for most of the story. At least so it seems. Going to be a little bit of retconning here. We'll talk about that when it comes up. But for the most part, we have Kana and Acho in with Prime Minister Manjome. And he's telling them about realizing that the man wearing Friend's mask is not the person he thought he had worked with all of these years. And it's been very unsettling for him. He asks that the two will kill him. Apparently, Fukube either doesn't have the ability, he doesn't have trustworthy minions to help him do this on his own. That's not surprising, as for most of his career, Manjome seems to have been a true believer. He honestly thought that the friend was some kind of supernatural entity who was there to completely rearrange the world. But whoever or whatever is under that mask now, he seems to only be interested in the annihilation of the human race, which is understandably upsetting. And that is pretty much all we get of that story thread for most of this installment. There are 11 chapters here to look at, and the vast majority of it, as you might expect, takes place with Kenji as the protagonist. Now that he's back, we have a lot of catching up to do with him. And it's a very interesting development of this character that we haven't seen for a very long time. We begin with him talking about fishing with Detective Chono. Chono hasn't had a whole lot to do on his days off except fish, so he's gotten pretty good at it. And Kenji admits he never liked fishing very much. His father was a fan of fishing, but whenever his dad went to fish, he wound up getting kind of ignored. And as a result, he never cared for fishing himself much. It was something that came between him and his family rather than a fun pastime. But we end with Kenji saying there was one fish he always wanted to catch, and he regretted not catching it. The big eel-headed thing. This is a reference to something that happened in Kenji's childhood. There was a gravel pit that supposedly had a monster fish in it, and everyone said if you could land it, it would grant you a wish. Well, nobody ever landed the fish, probably because it wasn't real, but it's not too hard to figure out that Kenji is actually talking about his friend, our friend. He's always regretted not breaking the FDP when he had a chance, and he did have many chances, he just didn't know they existed. That's not necessarily his fault, but obviously he still feels like he bears some responsibility for it. This is a pretty good setup for Kenji's character, because we haven't seen him in a long time. It's been a good 20 years, give or take, since we've really spent any significant chunk of time with Kenji. And we need to get an idea of where his head is at in order to understand what he's going to do. This kind of gives us that setup. There's a brief interlude where Haru Namio and Maro show up, and they have the producer from... Oh, that's not the right page. Here it is. They have the producer from the TV station there who has discovered something he shouldn't. He's realized... He's found the recording of Manjome and our friend on television, so this is something that could potentially get him executed. So they take him to the bowling alley where Kami-sama is living to lay low. This is pretty much just a bit of exposition to establish that they are actually doing something to protect this guy's life. That is an important thing for them because it shows that even though Namio and Maro are not taking as active a role in this part of the story, they are doing things that are important and are, advancing their own goals. But more importantly, it serves as a bit of foreshadowing, as most scenes with Kami-sama do. Of course, he hasn't been having visions as of late, but this producer from the TV station is not the only person staying with him. It turns out that Koizumi and the guitarist that she met are also crashing here, probably also at the behest of Maro and Namio. And if you remember, when she went to the VR game, Koyomi played a couple of rounds of bowling, and she caught the eye of Kami-sama's virtual avatar there. Well, she's bowling again at this bowling alley, and she's still really good at it, which catches Kami-sama's attention. As you can see right there, he's quite surprised to see her bowling like that. And Koyomi still has no interest in bowling, but Kami-sama, he can see it. For the first time in a long time, he catches a glimpse of the future. He's like, she's going to be big. There's going to be a bowling boom. That might just be his bias poking through. I doubt that this world had a bowling boom after all of this, but Yen says, I hear a crowd cheering. Coming. Something is coming. And of course, Kenji has been followed by a crowd all this time. So as soon as he says that, we cut to this, a border town. And Kenji and Chono have arrived here. They find a checkpoint. They see everybody who tries to sneak through the checkpoint with fake papers getting executed. And at the end of that wonderful sequence, we see Kenji and Chono at a graveyard saying, this is, not so great. This is, at first glance, a pretty straightforward storyline. There's introduction of a new character, a coyote who tries to smuggle people through the border. There's talk about getting passes. And really, the purpose of this storyline is just to bring together a bunch of characters to bust down the checkpoint. And it's an interesting and eclectic mix of people. There's references to movies like The Great Escape and the Seven Samurai in here. And a lot of stuff happens. Probably the most important thing that happens before they go to the checkpoint is they find out that one of the two manga artists that used to live next door to Kana left Tokyo before the opening of the expo in 2015, and he's been stranded outside of Tokyo ever since. He went to visit his mother, who was ill, and he's never been able to get back to work with his partner again. He tried forging passes, but it didn't work very well. Only one of the 3 passes he made got through. And he's gone back to working on manga. Kenji wants to go through the checkpoint, so he tries to talk the guy into forging a pass for him. There's an interesting part here where Kenji plays music to persuade the manga artist. Not so much, he doesn't inspire him, but he uses music as an object lesson, which is very interesting. And there's a lot of good exchanges here, but the important bit is that as he plays music and inspires the manga artist, the manga artist says to him, well, you could probably change the world with music. And Kenji says, don't be ridiculous. You can't change the world with music. And that's an interesting thought for him to introduce at this point. We've already seen him stare down a guard at the previous checkpoint with just music. So why he's being followed by a crowd too, who has been captivated by his musical performance. So why is he saying you can't change the world with music? Especially because he said, that the manga that he had read from the manga artist was quite good and kind of inspiring. Well, we're not going to get the answers to those questions, but the way they are introduced here is very, very organic. We have 2 artists discussing what drives them, what inspires them, and what intimidates them about the art they create. It's a very good scene, and it gives a lot of insight into what we are then going to learn later on about how Kenji is going to use music and art to inspire people, because this is his primary weapon against our friend. Our friend had charisma and fake promises. Kenji has music and hard lessons. That is a very interesting contrast. And we're about to see him teach one of those hard lessons. So who is at the checkpoint? The checkpoint has a governor on top of it, and we see him talking as he watches a bunch of I'm not sure if these are supposed to be security cameras or replays of anime or what, but he is associating himself with famous anime villains. He's like, I'm going to be an evil man. I'm going to incarnate evil and oppress the people here. And obviously, this is the guy Kenji has to confront. As we move the situation forward, a couple of interesting things happen. First of all, Kenji manages to get people through the checkpoint with the fake papers. And that's pretty impressive, but it's not actually something Kenji did. He just convinced the manga artist to produce the papers and then had the courage to go through the checkpoint with them, inspiring everyone else to follow behind him. Very simple decisions on Kenji's part, and that's important, but not right now. What's most important right now is the guy who's in charge of the checkpoint itself. You may recognize this guy, you may not. He is actually the playboy who seduced Dr. Shikishima's daughter way back at the beginning of the story. Yes, he played a hand in undermining the robotics professor who would create the Bloody New Year's Eve robot. And we've seen him basically just be a callous, self-serving jerk the whole story when he shows up. He's not been a particularly common recurring antagonist, but this is his moment in the sun. And we learn that his goal is to just be as sleazy and self-serving and, as he describes it, evil as he can possibly be. And at this point, we get a flashback that gives this guy some context in his relationship with Kenji. We get a flashback to when Kenji was in college and the sleazebag was in high school. And we see Kenji going around and doing a lot of favors for people. And then this sleazebag kind of undoing most, but not all of them. Because he's just trying to be a jerk to people. He is going out deliberately to play the role of a petty villain. And I really don't like this particular angle between these two characters. I would have preferred this guy to be kind of like number 13. Someone who just got swept up in the friend cult, and maybe he always wanted to be, this kind of overblown theatrical villain because he thought that was a cool aesthetic or something, or he thought it was really freeing, just do whatever you want regardless of who got hurt. I don't think he needed such a direct personal connection to Kenji. I think that is overkill. And especially retconning it into the story at this point, I'm not a huge fan of that. I think some of these villains could have stood on their own with less of a connection to Kenji directly. And admittedly, really, it's just our friend who has that direct personal connection. Adding one to this character, however, at this late juncture in the story, I don't think it works as well as Urasawa might have hoped. Especially because it does feel very tacked on just to give this kind of context to what's going to happen next. We've known for a while that there was a man courting Kiriko. He was fairly wealthy. He wanted to give her an opportunity to study medicine. And he was legitimately in love with her. He probably could have spared Kenji from having to take over the liquor store by giving him and his mother a place to live. Kenji could have continued to pursue music. Many differences would have happened in their lives, but most importantly, our friend would not have been able to gain leverage over Kiriko and Father Kana with her if this guy had actually married Kiriko. So he sends the scumbag to deal with this complication. And he does. He murders this man by shoving him in front of a train. Fairly easy way to kill someone in Japan, as it turns out. And then he makes an opportunity for our friend to step in, console the heartbreaking Kiriko, and alter the course of her life and history as a result. we come back to the modern era to find him laughing, having told this story to Kenji. Man, what a jerk! What a jerk! And he's the first person to identify Kenji without being prompted from the outside. I suppose Detective Chono identified him as well. So he's the second person, I should say. But what unfolds between these two as the people outside begin dismantling the checkpoint is a fascinating study in contrasts. The scumbag relates all of the bad things he thinks he's done. He murdered Kiriko's fiancée. He assisted in constructing the robot that rampaged through Tokyo. He handed out the briefcases that were unleashed the latest round of plague during the World Expo opening. He feels like he's a really evil person. And Kenji counters by telling him, man, your story is really terrible. I mean, it was great up until you pushed the guy off onto the train tracks. But after that, it all rings hollow. And Kenji's point here is that at the beginning, we hear the confession of a man who's riddled with guilt. And everything after that, his glorification of the bloody New Year's Eve attacks and the second coming of the plague, is an attempt to flee from his sense of guilt by building himself up as a villain. If he's a villain, what does it matter that he feels guilty? He's supposed to be evil, right? He can excuse his actions just by casting himself as a villain, a character in a story, not a human being who has to deal with real emotions and real guilt. And that is ultimately what begins to tear apart his sense of self, his sense that he can manage this situation. And what Kenji tells him is, go back just a bit. We don't really get an idea of what Kenji did in the time he was missing up until this point. And I'm not sure if I've made that clear in previous videos. But this is where Kenji gives his own testimony, his own defense. Where has he been all this time? What has he been doing? What does he want to do now that he's back? Lots of people have been asking those questions, but Kenji has kind of slipped around them. He's referred to himself as manga characters, usually heroic ones, yes, but he's never explained why he hasn't been that hero for the past 15 years. And we get the story of Bloody New Year's Eve from Kenji's perspective. There's no flashbacks. We just see him telling it to another man, a man who has walked a very different path in life. And what he tells him is, on Bloody New Year's Eve, when he failed to stop the robot, everything around him exploded, and he ran in terror. Can't really blame him for that. Kenji was a normal man. He was not a hero. He didn't have nerves of steel. He didn't live his life by violence. He was just the man in the right place at the right time to do something. He didn't succeed in doing it. And he ran from his failure. He ran from his fear. He ran for 15 years. He didn't even want to remember who he was. But when the second outbreak of the plague came about, he had to go back to being Kenji. He was forced to confront memories, who he was, and what he had to do. And he found he didn't like feeling guilty anymore. He turned around. He chose to be a good guy. He chose to defend justice and rightness. And he came back to Tokyo to settle his score with his old friend. And he met this man along the way. Tells him, if you're going to be evil, why are you still stuck on murdering my sister's boyfriend? How come you're still going on about it? It's a boring story. Yes, did a lot of damage, but there's something that is much more important here. Kenji asked, what's your name? And when I first read this, I realized this character is not named at anywhere in the story that I'm aware of. And I did look for his name as I went through my reread. I'm pretty sure he's not given a formal name up until this point. In fact, we don't even get it here. I think we'll get it later. But it's an important question because what Kenji wants to know is not the story he's telling about himself and the things he's done. He doesn't want to hear about how he's a force of evil. He wants to know about how he's a human being. He wants to know the most basic thing you can know about another person. He's got a name. Kenji wants to hear it. And rather than telling him his name, he tries to shoot himself. Kenji stops. And he says, Kenji says, it's hard being evil. A lot easier being a good guy. And there is something to that. We have seen Manjome and number 13, and of course our friend, all go to incredibly great lengths to become these villains. Work themselves to the bone, and they've never seemed very happy about it. While Kenji and his friends were normal people, and they were quite content with that until they were forced to be something else. I think that is the first hard lesson that Kenji brings us. Being a good person seems lame, seems boring, doesn't seem very appealing. But ultimately, in the end, it's a lot easier on you than being a villain. All that flash, all that posing, all of those things, they don't really hold you up in the end. You're left trying to carry all these things that you thought would make your life easier, just become an albatross around your neck. Whereas Kenji, when he put those things down, when he put down his fear and his fleeing from guilt, he turned around to come back to Tokyo. He's found his life a lot easier. Difficult lesson to bear, but it's an important one. And that is pretty much the end of that story arc. We get the beginning of the next one, of course, in the last couple of pages here, where we see Kana finally meeting Yoshitsune, and got Acho in tow, and Kana says, it's time to kill the friend. And that is the beginning of the end for all of our characters. But it's the actual end of this installment. Pretty good installment. It's very meaningful on the whole. There are, as I said, parts that I don't like in the way Urasawa constructed this story, but all in all, we're starting to get payoffs for all this time we spent in setup. And I really like it. I'm glad that we're here. And we're going to get more of the same for the most part. Anyways, let me know what you think of that installment down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button there. You can use those as you see fit. And I'll talk to you later.